experience after meeting him and talking about these interventions. I had to do some power calculations for an experiment I was hoping to design, and I started looking in the literature, and everywhere I looked, people were citing this S. Rowdenbush book. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And it took me a little while to make this connection that it was the same guy I'd been talking to about early childhood interventions. But yeah, exactly. But that was a sort of interesting experience for me. And the second person is Mike McPherson, who is currently the president of the Spencer Foundation. And in the past, he was also the president of Macalester University. And I also first learned about Mike through his research, not his leadership roles. The program that I was talking about yesterday, called One Goal, the point of the program is to help kids go to college. The curriculum was actually heavily designed based on a book that Mike had written about college performance called Crossing the Finish Line, Completing College in America's Public University. So it's great to have him discuss and give another perspective on this issue. Thank you very much. And I think the format will be, we'll give each of you a chance to say a few words and then open it up for discussion.
We should start with these guys.
Okay.
Starting in reverse order.
Well, but one psychologist who's had a lot of influence on my thinking, though not a psychologist, is Albert Bandura. His notion of self-efficacy as a cognition that mediates between the outcomes you experience and your next action. Okay, so if I am learning, if I'm a violinist, I have high self-efficacy if I think that I can go before an audience and do a terrific job playing this Brahms concerto. And that doesn't necessarily mean the audience is going to like it, right? But if the audience, if I have high self-efficacy, if the audience doesn't like it, then I conclude that the audience doesn't like Brahms. Okay, I don't conclude that I did a lousy job. And one thing about and I think this idea, and actually Angela talked earlier about cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea that there are ways of interpreting your outcomes that can change your behavior in good ways is a powerful idea. Just as an aside, that it became relevant in my work, working with Rob Sampson and Tony Earls. We were looking at urban neighborhoods and crime, and we had a big survey of people living all over the city of Chicago, and we came up with this idea of what we called collective self-efficacy. And that was the idea that you could rely on your neighbors to intervene to protect safety. The thing about self-efficacy or collective efficacy is that they're situated. They're not global. The person who is the great violinist was not necessarily good at, or did not think that I was going to do a great job shooting baskets or diagramming English sentences. It was the violin. It was all about the violin. Our measure of collective self-efficacy has been shown to work for predicting future crime, but not health and other things. So it's situated. It's not global. So that got me to thinking. When looking at what Angela wrote about self-control as being an idea that voluntary self-governance in the service of personally valued goals. To me, that sounds very situated. It's with respect to these personally valued goals that you have this self-control. And that made me ask myself, why are we using global concepts of self-control, conscientiousness, and executive function? I mean, it would be great if people could be globally high on all of those things. But is it really all about using these global measures to predict, or do we want to cultivate these things with respect to specific social goals that we really care about? And that got me to thinking about how would you intervene in schools to improve soft skills, self-control, conscientiousness, et cetera. And I think, it would be with respect to the tasks that we ask children to do in schools. So reading is one. So, and I'm kind of bringing this up because I want to get at the breakdown, maybe the dichotomy between cognitive, non-cognitive a little bit. That, there's executive function, self-control, focusing your attention, essential for learning how to read. Teachers have to know how to organize a classroom to do that. They have to get kids to be able to do that. And whether, now you can say also, well, the kids have to show up, and they have to not fight with each other. So there's other aspects. So they need self-control for those things. But if you don't learn how to read, you don't want to go to school. And you're much more likely to get in fights, conceivably. At least, well, there's certainly a strong correlation between not knowing how to read and being disengaged from school and not knowing how to read and becoming aggressive. Now, that's contentious. We can discuss what that's all about. But, and then if we want to think about how is schooling going to pay off in the labor market, it's the extent to which those tasks that we ask kids to develop those skills to achieve in school are aligned with what workplaces expect people to do. And so I guess my main comment is, don't we need to think about these things in a much more situated way? And don't we need to align the skills we want kids to develop with the tasks that we think are socially valuable, and then develop a theory of how we produce good workers and good citizens that's a little bit more integrated in those ways.
Thank you. I read an article recently in the New York Times about how with the development of super PACs and the ability of individuals to give millions of dollars to campaigns, that candidates find themselves having to spend increasing amounts of their time listening to people who gave them money, even though they don't have any reason to respect what those people think. So here I am. I definitely bought my way into this conference, and I have enjoyed it tremendously.
No, we have to raise the price.
Well, I'm keeping the price on my side pretty low because I'm not going to talk too long. But I do want to, in effect, pick up on part of the theme that Steve was talking about. I am the co-author, I want to underscore, of a book called Crossing the Finish Line about completing college with Bill Bowen, a teacher of Jim Heckman's, and Matt Chingos. And one of the big things that we emphasized in that book, which was consistent with stuff that had been done roughly contemporaneously with people at the Consortium for School Research in Chicago, was the huge importance of grades, high school grades, in predicting college graduation compared to SAT scores, whose predictive value is actually, when you control properly for the quality of high school, 0. If you introduce SATs and grades into a prediction equation at the same time. So I think the work that Tim has done and that Jim has led with the GED, underscoring how important grades are and how undervalued they are as evidence about what people can do and tend to do, is really interesting. But it also makes me think that the simple dichotomy of cognitive, non-cognitive probably is, and I'm sure you agree, is basically too simple. That what you see think of a high school grade point average. What these grades reflect is a variety of more or less formal and informal assessments of a range of tasks observed by a number of experienced observers, but not within a standardized rubric, extended over a period of years. That is a huge body of information that we peculiarly reduce to a single number, but that still assembles evidence across a wide range of task performances. And I think one of the important things that Jim's recent theoretical framework underscores is that all of these task performances reflect a variety of traits, capabilities, and so on, some of which we would think of as more cognitive and some as less cognitive. A good example of this is if you look at the Common Core, one of the overarching requirements on the math side of the Common Core is that students should acquire the ability to persist productively in solving complex mathematical problems. Now, I don't think that's a result of a general trait of persistence. Persisting in learning how to shoot a three-point basket is a very different kind of persistence from the sort of strategic, resourceful, know when to stop going down this road and back up and go down a different road that's involved in productive persistence in mathematics. And again, I think we get localized measures of this stuff from grades in a way that we would never get from standardized tests. So I think the grading thing is really important and interesting, but something we haven't studied and that really deserves study is how do teachers form these grades? We treat them as data, but the teachers are reflecting some judgments that they made. Again, they're experienced observers, so they're not idiots, but they're not in a rigid rubric that determines how they're making these judgments. And yet the aggregation of them maybe has a certain kind of wisdom of the crowd, wisdom of the wise crowd in this case, that we should understand, I think, a lot better than we do. I think it would be an interesting research program. Ironically, there is a movement afoot to standardize grading so that it looks more like test scores. That could be just a huge mistake. So that's my thought.
Okay, well, I've already said a lot over the last 2 days. I started the conference, and I don't want to really end it, because I hope we can have some general discussion on the following point. I would go back to this distinction that's been made several times here now, and most recently here, is that in this panel, about the distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive. I think every psychologist hates the term non-cognitive, certainly developmental psychologists. But I think it just an historical way to kind of frame the question, there was something more than what was measured by an IQ or an achievement test. So it was really just an empirical goal. And I think finding out that grades were very predictive, some of the work that Angela did with Martin Seligman, and some of the work we also did, GED, I think that was extremely, I think that was useful to kind of add that to the discussion. I completely agree that we want to come up with much more refined measures than were put there in place. But when you think about the inventory, I was just reminded, you know, you're talking about the GED book. Actually, in the book, we actually talk about the history of testing. And it's kind of interesting because I think the first person to think about testing, at least in modern American society, I know the Chinese were doing this back a long time ago in the imperial exams, but most recently in the American context, Horace Mann, you know, was trying to come out with some standardized notion, and it's interesting because he wrote, you know, he was writing this a version. He didn't have anything like a standardized test. He couldn't. He didn't have the technology to really standardize or to really assess. But he did make the point that, you know, and he said this. I can't quote it verbatim. Maybe Tim can. And John Eric, because we did use this quote repeatedly. And that is the least of what we teach in school is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And a lot of the other lessons that we taught about life are probably more valuable. I think that's been a recurrent theme of just about every thinker of modern education. And to me, and you know, most recently Ralph Tyler, who was the famous inventor of the achievement test. You know, he was dean here in the social sciences. Tyler, when he was writing about this in the 1940s and 1950s, said, you know, look, we have this achievement test. It's easy, you know, and it was great because you could use a Hollerith reader, you know, to somehow grade tests. And so there was a technological bias in favor of these standardized tests. But Tyler himself, when he was talking about NAEP, the early version of NAEP, he wanted much more complete inventories than just the achievement test. He was talking about grades. He was talking about, everybody's afraid of grades, right? Tyler was trying to get away from grades, partly because, some of the schools that he was trying to evaluate had completely different curricula, so it wasn't comparable. What was your grade in the lab school on, building a good sandbox or, making a nice garden? It didn't compare with what was taught at PS 21 in Brooklyn, say. So he wanted to get to some kind of general notion, the notion of a general skill. But I think what happened, and I think we're coming out of this is like a bad dream in some sense, that by the 60s and early 70s, with this great emphasis on cognition, and then you were citing Michel, but if Brent Roberts were here, he would be cursing the name of Michel, right? For precisely that early book that he wrote saying that personality psychology was a wasted enterprise. But I think it's extremely interesting how and I think this got into the mainstream. And I think this is in some sense what the danger is of academics, right? We develop these bodies of knowledge. And suddenly then the politicians, the policymakers, everybody who was a wonk, who really wanted to give good advice, picked up on achievement test as being the measure. So the PISA test, for an example, there were a lot of other tests with it. So I think where we're coming out of this kind of bad dream, where we're no longer able to we're no longer forced to think only about an acute IQ or achievement test. There's still a lot of pockets, though, resistance, right? And I think still, in terms of thinking of all the No Child Left Behind initiative, that was clearly test score driven, and the notion that somehow we should have even accountability systems. So as a broad notion, I think that this kind of conference and this kind of research that's been done the last 20 years by many people in this room is really very, very important. But I don't want to just praise ourselves here in this room. I think I would also go on and kind of go back to the questions that I framed at the beginning, and maybe we could turn it over to the general discussion. And that is, I think what we learned in the last 2 days, a lot of us got to meet each other for the first time. I think that was really good, and I hope there's even more of these encounters. It's kind of like, what is it, Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something. So we're not landing on a butte somewhere in Wyoming, but we are. There really is a sense that we are just learning what each other is doing. You actually were influenced, I think, by the agenda of the conference. Think about what a theory of proper testing would be. And there's just a lot of interesting work that I think remains to be done. That's easy to say, but I think there were very specific suggestions. So like in the inventories that people are thinking about in the school system, we started off with the OECD study I think there are some hints, more than hints, some really practical suggestions that some of the games, some of the other elicitation schemes, some of the measures that Tim talked about, some of the measures of behaviors really would be much richer inventories. It's kind of what Tyler was saying in some sense. He really wanted to look at absence records, he wanted to look at attendance, teacher ratings, all the things that people got scared about in terms of bias. But they actually turn out to be pretty predictive, as you were saying. I kept asking Bowen to go back a little bit earlier each time. You had 12th grade. I thought maybe what they were doing pre-K might be also predictive, but I never got him there. Yet not at least, I think he's down to 8th grade now, right? 7th grade. He's slowly working his way down to the early years. But quite seriously, I think that there are some valuable lessons, but it's also clear there needs to be more development where people are going to take these elicitation schemes. The games are practical. I think we can see that. They are being used. But and so I hope that OECD and a lot of other educational groups will think more broadly and try to develop much more comprehensive measures. I mean, it's going to lead to questions which will make it very unpleasant in the political domain. People want one number, right? They want to be able to say this school is good, this school is bad, and a comparison like a vector comparison is always messy in that regard. But it's really pretty essential, and we find that, like Bert was saying, there's a lot of compensation. Kids who might not be all that bright can compensate maybe in other ways, and there are a lot of different tasks out there where we have comparative advantage. So I would just kind of conclude my remark by thanking everybody for coming here, and then just repeating these questions and asking what people think was answered in these questions. I should have had a big billboard here. I do have a display, but I don't want to flash it on you guys, so I'll, no, I'll just repeat it. They're actually in your program, so I think you can go through the five questions, and they're not even the best 5 probably, but one was the question about...
That's 5, that's a start.
The big 5, yes. These are the great five, though. These are the really important five, not just the big five. No, but quite seriously, how predictive are these measurements? I mean, I think in the end, Armin had wanted to talk about causality. I agree with you, there are different notions of prediction. There could be a kind of association. But at least at the beginning, we want to know just how important these skills are. And then I think this was hinted at by everybody. I was very pleased to see this. I drew a diagram that's also in the program, if you look at it, where it's a very simplistic idea. You're saying multiple features are predicting outcomes. So in any given task, any test, any given set of, whether it's dropouts in high school or whatever, all of these are kind of caused by multiple factors. And I think we can know that. And, you were talking about that in your talk as well. And the question, I think, is can we separate these components out? And I think we can. I think we started talking about it. We didn't talk about it as systematically as we could. But I think we can through experimental variation. We can vary the incentives that people have, high stakes versus low stakes test, changing the incentive that students have to perform on a particular test or in a particular task. And I think there's a lot of progress that's being done. We heard a lot of models. I don't want to summarize every paper that was given, but there's some very exciting ways to imagine about inferring tasks, but also standardizing for the other conditions, time on the test, what the incentives are, what peer effects would be. When Durloff was talking about, he didn't quite get to measurement. He's talking about more skill development, but measurement would also be, how well should I do on this particular test? How much peer pressure there is. I'll give you a personal anecdote about peer pressure. I think I told you this story, but I'll repeat it. And that is, when I was in high school, there was something called the Iowa test. And a group of us got to the threshold of the Iowa test by 10th grade or something. We got sick of it. We thought, why are we going to take the test? So what we actually did, this was peer pressure, we said, to really understand that we know how well we do on the test, let's go for a perfect 0. Because you really know. You can guess, right? So if you don't really know the answer, 0 might be better than the right answer. So we all coordinated, and we got close to 0s. And the one who actually got the closest 0 was called into the principal's office. But I think there is a sense of these social factors. And we see that. We see that in the sense that there really are these social incentives and peer effects. And a lot of this culture that people talk about, Steve was talking about Agbu and all that. I think there really is a sense that there is a culture, who cares? And we see that there. So even in building and tests. So how do differences in environments and peers affect the accuracy of the elicited skills? And then the key point, which I didn't quite see, and many people didn't quite want to get to, was basically how do we separate the components of these skills? In the end, I think, if I were to fault the big five, here's Big Five himself here, so we'll solve it. To say, and I think true in a lot of the psychological measures. Here's IQ, and it measures a trait. But as we said, and I think we learned, that there are just multiple traits that are revealed by any of these. So probably the most important thing is to think of us as a vector of tasks with relative strengths on different skills to understand what those weights are. We started getting there in some of the papers. But I think we have to go a way further to separate that. And then the other question, which I think is really the huge question, and Armin got to it a bit in some of his work, didn't talk much about it today, but he could have talked more, and that is how comparable are these different skills? So there was one notion, the one that I was mentioning at lunch with Angela, we were going to basically put this together. So we were going to have a Rosetta Stone of psychology and economics. So here was the psychologies, here was the economies, and we were going to say, here, this really maps this way. Well, it didn't. So I think what we actually did was we built, instead of a Rosetta Stone, we actually created 2 or 3 dimensional objects that actually suggested maybe we had more dimensions. So no taking away from the big five or saying they're important, but nonetheless, when I put a lot of these measures into regressions, even consumption regressions or earnings regressions, they're not explaining all that much of behavior. There's still a huge amount. So even if you take explanation, I think it's even more serious if you start doing counterfactual prediction. So I would leave with those questions, and if other people have a sense of what those answers should be, or what has been answered, I think we should throw it open. I don't know how much time we have, Tim, but I guess we could stay here all day, lock the doors. But no, quite seriously, I would like, because I think this is very useful, and I hope we do a version of this again. I really hope that this is repeated play. We talked about repeated play. I think repeated play in this context could be very, very fruitful, right? Where we go over multiple waves, multiple meetings where we actually compare notes. Because I think many people will come out thinking, there really is something out there. And we should spend some time just absorbing what's been said and creating, I think, a really interesting synthesis. It isn't just a synthesis for its sake. I think it's really important for evaluation. So yes, please, yeah.
One thought. I agree very much with the remarks you just made. But I did also find myself thinking about the Spencer Foundation mission is to promote improvement in education through promoting deeper understanding of education. And so we are concerned very much about policy and about practice. And I think if you thought of the sort of the economists these days who are thinking most about education policy, they would be mystified by the fact that we're talking about anything but test scores here. And there's this big technological lead on improving measures of value-added test scores. But although they're not insignificant, they're so far from being the whole story that in many ways I worry that we're kind of swinging through the pitch here and not bringing policy attention, practical attention to these other dimensions of learning, many of which are clearly cognitive but aren't in test scores. So I do hope that those of you who have interest in education, and you don't all have to have interest in education by any means, but that you think about what could your results mean to teachers, mean to state-level administrators, mean to national policy. And I would even encourage radical steps like including teachers in conferences to, not necessarily a conference like this. I mean, it's a very high-end thing. They would not benefit much from it, but creating conversations that allow the voice of practice to come in, as John suggested at the outset.
It's really not a crazy idea that I now know that when you shower the teachers with new evidence of benefit of action A, action B, they are really impressed and they just want to do this, right? That they should be into it. They should know the evidence. They should be shown the evidence and see this. It affects their motivation. It affects what they want to do. It's not like some higher level bureaucrat imposing some curriculum on them which they hate, right? But when they see evidence, you see the motivation they have, right? You probably observe this as well if you're actually interacting with teachers.
They can also help us ask better questions.
Right, also they shape our questions. You're right, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that the kinds of very broad measures like IQ, like achievement tests, are particularly unhelpful for teachers for knowing what to do next. The kind of assessment that is most exciting to us who are interested in education, it was interesting to me seeing the diagram that you post where you have performance and you have thetas up here and there was an arrow going down from thetas to performance, then another arrow with a question mark. Well, we want that to be a plus. So you think, how can you adapt the context and how can you adapt the situation of performance to maximize that plus going back? And you can't do that with broad, every person measure. You get the most impact when you can contextualize that to what is being learned, to what the activity is, to the interest, to the prior knowledge of the student. And so teachers get excited by that. You build that into learning systems. That's where you get the biggest payoffs. And it's not at all a simple, easy thing where you give it to everybody. If you do it well, you'll get some positive benefits that might show up in those things. And that's nice. But those are not the things that guide what you do.
But how far are we along the way towards like a personalized education? I mean, there's like personalized medicine where people, I think there really is. So people, I mean, a lot of the developmental people will talk about scaffolding, but there really is. We went to a preschool a few years ago in Kentucky, and what was interesting, they were keeping records each week of how well the kids were doing. And then the teachers decided, and then what were they going to work on the following week? This is very much like Susan Murphy's dynamic treatment regime that was referred to earlier. And it seems to me that we are, I mean, they were doing it in practice. They didn't, this was in Western Kentucky. They weren't particularly ignorant or sophisticated, but it struck me as something really much better than the idea we're going to have a standardized test
Yes.
and cut down schools based on poor performance. And something like
It is doable. And the projects that I've worked on that have actually done it have been ones with the military, with Cisco, in medical education, localized. And what's common among them is that they were all outside runs around the big education establishment. And so, one other anecdote, you might know that like 20, 30 years ago, Lauren Resnick had this new standards project. She was going to have these assessments that could teach people to do well in those that would improve education. And I was an advisor on the portfolio portion of that. And we worked on things so that they could be contextualized, but you would have standards in the way of evaluating and things that you needed to work on to have in your projects. And when they took those out to the schools, the teachers, the principals, the superintendents said, this is wonderful stuff, but we can't do it. We would have to change what we do in the classrooms if we're going to have this kind of assessment and this kind of teaching. So yeah, I think there has been more progress on understanding how people learn, situations for doing it, ways to assess it and give feedback. More progress there than there is progress on how to get that put into large educational structures.
Well, we could have a discussion about large educational structures. We're here in Chicago after all.
Oh yeah.
But that's another discussion. I mean, I certainly agree that there's a lot of inflexibility. And Angela, you have
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried about time, right? Because it's a little bit. Maybe I'll just say it. So yesterday, because today's October 2nd, right? So yesterday I took over the Character Lab, which is a nonprofit that I decided to found while I was also on tenure track. It's probably not a great idea, but it's a 501c3 nonprofit that takes money from hedge fund managers and puts it into the science and the practice and the engineering of learning. Luckily, there are just a gajillion really rich hedge fund managers.
Yeah, that's a break.
so I guess I'll just say this. So, you know, Sula was talking about how the intervention that was alluded to, this Kirk intervention, was vastly improved by the active involvement of some really great teachers who had, frankly, better contributions than the psychologists. I think that's definitely a sort of a thing that I want to have happen. I don't think every teacher has, you know, the same amount to contribute, but there are some teachers who have an enormous amount to contribute. And I'll give you an example that's relevant to measurement. So to Steve's point, it's well known in psychology that the domain-specific variance in a trait is correlated with other. So self-control in the domain of food is correlated about 0.3 with self-control in the realm of getting your work done on time, right? So the correlation is not 0, but then again, it's only 0.3, so there's a tremendous amount of domain specificity. And because of that, if you're thinking about creating an assessment that's useful for an 8th grade teacher, you know, you don't want the kind of omnibus, like in general, how they self-control. You want something very school specific. Are they paying attention in class? Do they follow directions? Can they clean out their locker? You know, do they hit back when somebody hits them in the classroom, on the playing field? So what we did was we took a group of 8th grade kids and we took their teachers and we gave pieces of paper to everybody and they started writing down what self-control looks like in their life. You know, on Tuesday, this is what happened. We kind of bottom up created measures that were domain specific. And yet, because there were people like me around, like kind of at least aligned somewhat to theory. It's not just completely blind. You know, ignorance of Walter Michel's work, ignorance of William Metzger's work. And you know, we ended up with an 8-item measure, 4 items on self-control that had to do with schoolwork, 4 items that had to do with interpersonal stuff as it plays out in the life of an 8th grader, not just anyone. And I think we created a fairly practical and brief measure, which, you know, at least it creates, I'm not saying it's the whole touchdown, but it's like that's the step in the direction, and that's the target for intervention. Not like, we should just make people more self-control, but like, let's look at those specific behaviors and see if we can do that. And then let's get the teachers to help us. And you know, we'll teach them the growth mindset, we'll tell them about all these theories, but then they'll say, oh, right, and then they'll tell us how to do it right. So, you know, in the future, if you are looking for research opportunities, we're matching researchers with schools. So we're kind of like Match.com for K-12 schools. We have like thousands of educators who've signed up and are eager to work with people like you. And as soon as I raise more money, we'll also have more money. So maybe if you want to look at it, it's characterlab.org.
I'm going to interject